I never thought a single night could unravel everything I had built. But here I am, staring at my phone, his name flashing across the screen like a bad omen. My brother-in-law. My mistake. My secret. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. A few too many drinks, a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment that should have ended the second the sun came up. But it didn't. Because now, weeks later, he won't let it go. And worse part of me doesn't want him to. I love my husband. At least, I thought I did. We've been together for 8 years, built a life, shared dreams, and yet, in one reckless night, I shattered the foundation of it all. The guilt is suffocating, curling around me like a vice. Every time he kisses me, every time he says he loves me, I hear the echoes of that night in my head. I feel his brother's hands on me, his breath against my skin. The weight of it is unbearable. I tell myself it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything. But if that's true, why do I keep replaying it in my mind? Why do I feel a thrill every time I see his name appear on my phone? He says he can't stop thinking about me. That one night wasn't enough. That he knows I feel it too. I should end this. Block his number. Confess to my husband. Do something, anything to stop the inevitable train wreck heading my way. But I don't. I hesitate. I let it linger. Because the truth I don't want to admit? I'm not sure I want to stop. My sister and I were never the type to braid each other's hair or stay up whispering secrets into the night. We weren't exactly distant, but we weren't inseparable either. She was always the responsible one, the overachiever, the planner. I was the one who floated through life, never quite settling on a path, always feeling like I was a step behind. She got married first, of course. A picture-perfect wedding, a house in the suburbs, a career that made our parents beam with pride. And then there was her husband, Mark. Mark was the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Confident but never arrogant, charming in a way that felt effortless. He had a way of making people feel at ease, of making you feel seen. And, maybe because I spent my whole life standing in my sister's shadow, I noticed that about him more than I should have. It wasn't an instant attraction. At least, not in the way people expect. I never looked at him and thought, I want him. It was something slower, more insidious. A glance that lingered a second too long. A laugh that felt just a little too private. Conversations that edged toward the personal, then veered away at the last second. It was never inappropriate, never anything you could point to and say this is wrong until suddenly, it was. Still, I never believed it would actually happen. I thought I was imagining the way his eyes found mine across the dinner table, the way his fingers brushed my arm when no one was looking. I convinced myself it was nothing, just a trick of my own restless mind. But now, looking back, I wonder if it was always leading to this. If every stolen moment, every unsaid word, was another step toward the night that changed everything. My sister never saw it. She had too much faith in me, in him, in the life she built. And I hate myself for proving her wrong. It started with a drink. Not in a cliché, I was drunk and didn't know what I was doing way I knew. I was aware of every single choice I made that night. But the alcohol blurred the edges, softened the voice in my head that might have stopped me. It was a family gathering, one of those long nights where the wine flows too easily and the air hums with the comfortable chaos of people who have known each other forever. My sister was busy entertaining guests, moving through the room like she was born for it, effortlessly balancing laughter and conversation. Mark and I ended up on the back patio, away from the noise, away from her. The night was warm, the air thick with the scent of summer. The kind of night that makes everything feel heavier, thoughts, words, even silence. He handed me another glass of wine, his fingers brushing mine for just a second longer than necessary. I ignored the way my skin reacted, the way my pulse betrayed me. We talked about nothing and everything. How work was going. How exhausting these family events could be. How sometimes, even when you love the people around you, you still feel lonely. That last part slipped out before I could catch it. I wasn't sure why I said it, but I felt his eyes on me, something shifting in the air between us. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a sip of his drink, looking out at the darkened yard like he was considering his words carefully. Then, quietly, he said, "Yeah, I know what you mean. That should have been my warning. That should have been the moment I stood up, laughed it off, went inside to find my sister. But I didn't. I stayed. The conversation turned softer, more personal. He told me things he probably shouldn't have about how hard marriage could be, about how sometimes it felt like they were just going through the motions. And when he looked at me, I knew I should say something to shut it down. I should remind him that he loved my sister, that I wasn't the person he needed to be confiding in. Instead, I told him I understood. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of us, pulled together by something that had been simmering for too long. His hand found my wrist, tentative at first, as if waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I should have. The next moments were a blur of heat and desperation, of years of unsaid things finally crossing a line they never should have. Every touch was both a mistake and something inevitable, something I couldn't stop even as guilt curled in the back of my mind. We didn't speak after. We couldn't. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaled sharply, and muttered something about how this couldn't happen again. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. The weight of what we had just done settled between us, heavy and suffocating. I left before the sun came up. Before my sister woke to find her husband missing from their bed. But leaving didn't erase it. It didn't undo the way his hands had felt on me, the way my body had betrayed every ounce of logic I had. It didn't erase the look in his eyes when I turned back one last time, knowing this wasn't over. I told myself it was a mistake. One night. One moment of weakness. But some mistakes don't just go away. Some mistakes follow you, whispering in the quiet moments, waiting for you to make them again. The morning after, I told myself it was over. I repeated it like a mantra, willing it to be true. It was a mistake. A terrible, selfish mistake that could never happen again. I could live with that, I thought. I could bury it deep, pretend it never happened, and move forward like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Mark wasn't indifferent. He wasn't overcome with guilt, desperate to forget. If anything, he was the opposite. At first, he kept his distance. No calls, no texts, no subtle glances across the room. I almost let myself believe that we had both silently agreed to move on. Then, 3 days later, he sent a message. "Can we talk?" I stared at the words, my heart slamming against my ribs. I shouldn't have answered. I should have deleted the message, acted like I never saw it. But my fingers betrayed me before my brain could stop them. About what? You know what? I didn't respond. I couldn't. But it didn't matter, because the next time we saw each other at a family dinner, surrounded by people who would hate us if they knew the truth, he found me alone in the kitchen. His voice was low, careful. "I can't stop thinking about you." I pretended I didn't hear him. I grabbed a glass, filled it with water, anything to keep my hands busy. But he stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, close enough that my body betrayed me all over again. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said. Tell me that night meant nothing. I wanted to. I should have. Instead, I shook my head, not trusting my voice. He let out a sharp exhale, running a hand through his hair like he was as frustrated as I was. "I don't regret it," he admitted. "And I don't think you do either." I did regret it. But not enough. From that moment on, everything became a game of avoidance and near misses. Every family gathering felt like a test, every conversation a balancing act between normalcy and disaster. My sister noticed something was off. She had always been too perceptive for my own good. "You've been weird lately," she said one afternoon, her brows knitting together. "Is something going on?" I forced a laugh. "No, just work stress." She accepted the answer, but I saw the doubt in her eyes. Then came the close calls. A text from Mark when my sister was sitting next to me, just his name lighting up my screen was enough to send my stomach plummeting. A fleeting touch when no one was looking, my body betraying me with the way it reacted. The worst moment was the night he nearly said too much. We were at a family barbecue, the kind where everyone drank too much and stayed too late. My sister was inside, chatting with relatives, and Mark and I found ourselves alone on the patio again. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the cicadas. His gaze was heavy, unreadable. "Then tell me you don't want me." I opened my mouth, ready to say it to finally put an end to whatever this was. But my sister's voice called out from inside, breaking the moment. We stepped apart just as she appeared in the doorway, her eyes flicking between us with something dangerously close to suspicion. Mark recovered first, smiling easily. Just talking about the game next weekend. She didn't respond right away. And for a split second, I thought she knew. I thought it was over. Then she shrugged, oblivious. Come inside. Everyone's asking for you. She was asking for him. Her husband. The man who should never have been looking at me the way he was. I followed them inside, my stomach twisting into knots. I wanted to believe I could stop this. That I had the strength to walk away. But the problem with crossing a line is that once you do, there's no going back. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Mark didn't let it go. At first, he was patient. Subtle. A lingering glance when no one was looking, a brush of his hand against mine that felt too intentional to be accidental. He didn't push, but he didn't disappear either. He made sure I knew he was still there, waiting. I ignored him. I had to. I avoided being alone with him, kept my phone on silent so I wouldn't see his messages, pretended nothing had happened. But pretending didn't erase it. It didn't stop the way my body reacted when I saw him, the way my mind kept replaying that night in flashes of heat and regret. Then one evening, he caught me off guard. It was at my sister's house. A casual dinner, just family. I had been in the kitchen alone, washing dishes, when I felt him behind me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel his presence, the warmth of his body just inches from mine. We need to talk, he said quietly. I kept scrubbing the plate in my hands, my knuckles white. There's nothing to talk about. That's not true, and you know it. His voice was calm, steady, but there was something beneath it, something that made my pulse jump. Mark, stop. You don't mean that. I turned then, heart pounding, ready to shut this down for good. But his eyes locked onto mine, and I froze. He looked at me the way he had that night, like he knew me in a way no one else did. Like I was something he wasn't ready to let go of. I can't stop thinking about you, he murmured. I don't want to. Before I could respond, my sister's voice called out from the other room, shattering the moment. He stepped back just as she appeared in the doorway, drying his hands on a dish towel like nothing had happened. I felt sick. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind a battlefield of guilt and temptation. I wanted this to end. I wanted to go back to before. But some dark, selfish part of me, the part one hated, thrilled at the way he looked at me. The way he wanted me. And Mark knew it. His messages became bolder. Not desperate, not pleading, but confident. As if he was sure I would give in. I can't stop thinking about that night. Tell me you don't feel the same. Just once more. That's all I'm asking. I left him on read, but the messages sat there, burning into me. I couldn't delete them. I didn't know why. Then, the worst moment yet. A group dinner, friends and family crowded around the table. My sister was laughing at something, wine glass in hand, completely at ease. Mark sat across from me, his gaze unreadable. Then he reached under the table. His fingers brushed my knee. I went rigid, my breath catching. He didn't move away. Slowly, deliberately, his fingertips traced the inside of my thigh, light as a whisper. My heart slammed against my ribs. My sister was right there. Everyone was right there. I grabbed his wrist and yanked it away, my nails digging into his skin. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly, as if he had just won something. I barely made it through dinner. The second I could, I fled to the bathroom, gripping the sink so hard my knuckles turned white. This was getting dangerous. I had to stop this. Had to shut it down before it went too far. But when I finally worked up the courage to tell him it was over, he just smiled and shook his head. You don't want this to stop, he said, his voice smooth and certain. And we both know it. And the worst part? I wasn't sure he was wrong. The breaking point came on a night that should have been ordinary. A dinner at my sister's house, just like the dozens before it. My sister was in the kitchen, plating food, humming along to a song on the radio. Mark was next to me, close enough that his presence was impossible to ignore. I had spent weeks trying to avoid him, dodging his calls, ignoring his texts. But he hadn't stopped. If anything, he had become bolder, more sure of himself, more convinced that I would break before he did. And maybe he was right. I had been unraveling, the guilt pressing into my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. Every time my sister smiled at me, every time she reached for Mark's hand, I felt sick. I had stolen something from her, something she didn't even know was missing. And it was only a matter of time before she found out. That night, she did. It was something small that tipped her off. A glance, a hesitation, the way my body stiffened when Mark touched my shoulder in passing. She noticed. Her smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed, flicking between us like she was seeing something she hadn't before. I held my breath, willing her to let it go. But I knew my sister. She never let anything go. Later, when we were alone in the kitchen, she said it. "What's going on with you and Mark?" I dropped the knife I had been using to slice vegetables. It clattered against the cutting board, too loud in the silence. I forced a laugh. "What do you mean?" She didn't laugh. "You've been acting weird. And he's been different." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. "You're imagining things." She tilted her head, studying me. "Am I?" I should have kept denying it. I should have played dumb, laughed it off, said anything to make her drop it. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, silent, my face giving away more than my words ever could. Her expression shifted. She knew. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered, "Oh my God." And the way she said it quiet, like she couldn't believe it was real, was worse than if she had shouted. She backed away from me like I was something she couldn't bear to look at. "Tell me it's not true." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. That was answer enough. The next moments were a blur. Her hands shaking, her voice rising, demanding to know how long, when it started, how I could do this to her. I couldn't give her the answers she wanted. I could barely even look at her. Then Mark walked in. His eyes darted between us, and he knew. He knew before she even said anything. "Tell me she's lying," my sister said, her voice breaking. Mark hesitated. That hesitation was all she needed. I had never seen my sister cry before, not like that. Not the kind of tears that come from betrayal so deep it leaves a scar. She left the room. Mark went after her. I stood there, frozen, listening to the muffled argument in the next room. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I already knew what they were saying. I wanted to go to her, to say something, anything to fix what I had broken. But there was nothing left to say. So I walked out. I don't know if she'll ever forgive me. I don't know if I deserve it. All I know is that some mistakes can't be undone. And some betrayals last forever.